Hey, welcome to GothCast. I'm Dr. Sanders. Now, lately, everyone seems to be talking about the Avengers Infinity Awards, or whatever it's called, with the Iron Man and the Spooderman and all that stuff. And people talking about how great comic book movies are. But I think people really forget that the best comic book movie of all time came out in 1994, and it's called The Crow.
I saw recently in the news that the Crow remake or reinvention or whatever it's going to be finally has a release date, October 11th, 2019. I was going to tell you about how I'm not really that excited about it, but I think The Crow's author, James O'Barr, said it best. I don't have great expectations. I think the reality is, no matter who you get to star in it, or if you get Ridley Scott to direct it and spend $200 million, you're still not going to top what Brandon Lee and Alex Proyas did in that first $10 million movie. But this gives me a good excuse to talk about the original film. Released in 1994, the film is based on the 1989 comic book created by O'Barr. It's gritty, dark, and full of references to many of my favorite artists. It follows the story of a man named Eric who is revived by a magical crow after he and his fiancée are horribly murdered by thugs. He then picks off the bad guys one by one while being tormented by the memories of his lost love. O'Barr was inspired to write the book as a way of dealing with the sudden tragic death of his fiancée. She was killed by a drunk driver in 1978, and it obviously deeply affected him. This is reflected in the sadness Eric experiences while remembering his own fiancée Shelley. Now, the graphic novel and the film are similar, but do differ in some key ways. But I'll come back to that later. First, let's cover the film. Same premise, horrible rape and killing, with a revived Eric exacting revenge. The movie is extremely stylish and desaturated to mimic the look of the comic. The visuals really set the mood with heavy use of shadows and a constant rain that reminds me of my favorite movie, Blade Runner. Every character is played very well and are very memorable. The young girl Sarah sort of embodies the early to mid-90s in her fashion and attitude. Ernie Hudson plays the cop Albrecht, who is a combination of two characters from the book and becomes somewhat like Eric's sidekick. As far as villains go, they're all over the top, ridiculous evil, almost like caricatures of dumb bad guys for movies, but I would say it makes it all the better to see them perish. The Crow is actually a movie that I've somewhat put off making a video about because it's so beloved by so many. It's essentially the most goth superhero movie ever made. If that Sandman movie ever comes out, then it might have some competition. It also has one of the most iconic soundtracks of the 90s. It makes sense because Eric Draven is a musician in the band Hangman's Joke. Their logo really reminds me of the Social Distortion logo. Maybe it's just skeletons. The Cure song Burn is probably the most famous song associated with the movie. And for a song so well known, it's kind of funny that they didn't actually play the song live until 2013. But the actual comic book itself references a lot of different bands. The lyrics to The Hanging Garden are printed in their entirety on one page. Some chapters are named after Joy Division songs. Eric even quotes the song Disorder. My favorite song from the soundtrack is definitely Nine Inch Nails' cover of Joy Division's Dead Souls. I love the driving energy of this one. There are actually some really cool scenes in the movie with the bands My Life with a Thrill Kill Cult and Medicine. The use of music is fantastic, and some scenes feel like a music video. And it makes a lot of sense, because director Alex Proyas had previously come from a music video background. In fact, he did a lot of big videos inside the 1980s. One of the only things I wasn't a big fan of was the final fight with Top Dollar. Eric is an unstoppable killing machine for the entire film, but of course they find a way to make him so weak that he almost loses. Now, I know this is really common in movies, but The Crow is so unique in so many ways that I think they could have gone a different route. Actually, in the comic, Eric really is unstoppable and easily murders everyone in gruesome ways. The movie version of the character has a bit more of a hero's struggle story. I mean, he literally uses the memory of Shelley to win, whereas the comic book character comes off a little more unhinged and manic. He engages in self-mutilation, injects drugs into his chest, and his kills are much more violent. He isn't all bad, of course. He has an army of adorable kitties, and Gideon in the comic book is so awesome. The Crow in the comic actually speaks to Eric and tells him he shouldn't focus on the memories that haunt him. He's actually kind of a jerk. There aren't many other major differences between the two, mostly the order that the bad guys are killed in. And by the way, you probably know the famous scene where Eric quotes the Raven. Well, there's an alternative take where he actually raps the phrase.
Suddenly, I heard a tapping, as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. You heard me rapping, right?
Also, James O'Barr makes a cameo as a guy stealing a TV when Gideon's shop blows up. Awesome. As many of you probably know, this was Brandon Lee's final film, as he was tragically killed on set. A scene was being filmed where Eric walks into his apartment and encounters Shelley being attacked. Michael Massey, who played Funboy, fired a revolver at Lee, which was improperly loaded. Now, I'm going to do my best to explain what happened. If you don't want to hear this kind of stuff, then you could skip to this point in the video, just to skip this whole part. The gun had been used in a previous scene using dummy cartridges that were made by the prop crew. The cartridges were meant to contain a bullet without gunpowder or a primer, so it wouldn't be propelled out of the firearm when the trigger is pulled. Unfortunately, the crew unknowingly left the live percussion primer at the rear of the cartridge. The gun was discharged at some point, and the primer expelled enough force to lodge the bullet in the barrel of the gun. The prop crew didn't seem to realize this, and when filming the scene with Lee, they loaded blank rounds, which are essentially the opposite. It has a powder charge and a primer with no bullets. There's no metal part to be propelled out of it. Blanks are usually used because they make a flash and an explosive sound. You can still be fatally injured by a blank cartridge, but it's most common at a close distance. When the gun was loaded with the blank rounds and fired at Lee from around 12 to 15 feet away, the force from the blank drove the lodged bullet out of the gun and struck him in the abdomen. He was rushed to a hospital in North Carolina, underwent 6 hours of surgery, but was unfortunately pronounced dead at 1:03 p.m. on March 31st, 1993, at just 28 years old. Lee's mother filed a civil lawsuit that was settled out of court, and the death was ruled accidental. Brandon was buried next to his father, Bruce Lee, who had also died suddenly at a young age just before the release of his film Enter the Dragon. Actor Michael Massey quit acting for the next year and refused to view the finished product. It seemed to heavily affect him for the rest of his life.
It absolutely wasn't supposed to happen. I wasn't even supposed to be handling the gun in the scene till we started shooting the scene and the director changed it. It wasn't supposed to happen for a myriad of reasons. He was so far off that had it been a real gun, we wouldn't have been able to hit the side of a barn with it, you know? What the bottom line is, it did happen. Like any accidents aren't supposed to happen. The car accident isn't supposed to happen if you look at it in retrospect. It did happen in the media spotlight, and I don't feel, as someone who is closely involved with Brandon, with the film and the accident, to me it's just never come up as something to talk about it, because why would you do it? It's not something that I feel, it's a very personal thing.
After Lee's death, the filmmakers negotiated a deal with Miramax to finish the movie using existing footage of Lee and digitally placing his face over stunt double Chad Stahelski. Certain scenes were rewritten, and the character the Skull Cowboy was completely cut from the final product. He is in the original comic and had multiple scenes filmed for the movie. He would have laid down the rules of the dead for Eric and constantly scold him for doing things like helping Sarah or draining the drugs from Darla's veins, because they interfered with the quest he was brought back for. There was also a change in the soundtrack. You probably know that the Stone Temple Pilots song Big Empty appears in the film, but originally their song Only Dying was going to be included. It was changed because the song didn't seem appropriate given the circumstances. I actually prefer the song to the one that was included, but I totally understand why it was swapped out. The song was eventually included as a bonus track on the 25th anniversary version of their album Core. The final cut of the movie was dedicated to Brandon and his fiancée Eliza. A dedication to him is also included in reprints of The Crow graphic novel. I mean, how could you not love The Crow? Both the movie and the book are works full of genuine emotion, good and bad. I obviously highly recommend it, and if you're going to pick up a physical copy, I enjoy this Blu-ray. Lots of special features, and Alex Proyas' commentary is really interesting. He even talks about the movie's impact on the goth subculture.
At some point while just as we were in pre-production, I realised that this film was like the ultimate gothic fantasy, as in terms of the goth subculture. You know, I could be wrong, and maybe it's claiming more for the film than I should, but I sort of got the impression that this film was kind of instrumental in reviving the goth culture to a certain extent, because it was something that I mean, having, you know, being someone who's been into music for a very long time now, I remember goths certainly in Australia and England being around in the early 80s. You know, that's when the peak sort of impact of that sort of subculture hit England and Australia. In America, I wasn't really sure where they fit in. I was aware that they were around, but it seems like there's been this kind of rebirth of that. I know I'm seeing a lot more people on the streets, and that's fine because I think they look cool. So I really think that this had some impact on that. You know, once I sort of became aware of that, and I could see it so strongly in the styling of the comic books as well, we really went for it. I mean, we really pushed the film, you know, stylistically, fashion and art direction-wise into that world, because I just thought it was not really done and hadn't really been done in movies that much, you know.
So go track it down any way you can. And if it's too rainy outside to drive, don't worry. It can't rain all the time.
I hope you enjoyed my look at The Crow. And, you know, Eric Draven may be popping up in some other things I talk about in the future. So stay tuned for that. But other than that, just go find it, go watch it, and yeah, that reboot will be something, right? You can like, comment, subscribe, and follow my Instagram and all that stuff. And of course, stay spooky. Wha-cha.